Before the stars whispered, before Nirn had a name, there was the Orbis. Not space, not time, not something to hold or measure. The Orbis was a dream adrift in the sea of possibility, a great churning of chaos, pure thought, unformed and eternal. It was a place where contradiction could live without friction, where all things were possible and none yet real. There were no lands, no people, no heavens, no hells. Only motionless potential and infinite silence waiting for the first sound. From this eternal dusk, the spirits began to dream themselves awake. They were the Aedra, original spirits, shapes of will and song, vibrating into being. Some were vast and cosmic, others small and curious. They flickered with the brightness of purpose. They were neither good nor evil, only essence. Some chose to understand the nature of their new awareness. Others chose to shape, still others to destroy or absorb. Among them came one unlike the rest. Lorkhan. He was not the mightiest, not the oldest, but he was the most dangerous. For Lorkhan possessed something rare among spirits, an idea. Where others dreamed safely within the stars, Lorkhan reached out beyond the dream. He envisioned a place where the Orbis could be grounded, where thought could take form and form could suffer. He imagined a space where limitations gave meaning, where death gave value to life. In this idea, time would flow, boundaries would form, choices would matter, and mortals, children of stardust and sorrow, would walk. The other spirits listened in awe and dread. Some, like Magnus, were drawn to this idea, intrigued by its brilliance. Others, like Auriel, recoiled, fearing the loss of their purity. They saw Lorkhan's plan not as creation, but imprisonment, a betrayal of their eternal nature. Yet Lorkhan spoke with honeyed wisdom and radiant fire. He said, "To limit oneself is to become. To become is to know truth." And though he was called a trickster, many began to follow. And so it was agreed, reluctantly or eagerly, that a world would be made. Not all consented. Some remained in the outer voids, untouched by fate. But many of the Aedra gave themselves to the making of Mundus, the mortal plane. They poured their essence into it, shaping earth, sea, sky, and the laws that govern them. Each gift was a loss. Each act of creation diminished them. To build the world was to die a little. Some fell, some fled, and some would never be whole again. Magnus, realizing the cost, tore himself away from the project, escaping through the veil he helped design. His departure ripped a hole in the sky. The sun, gateway of light and magic. Others followed, fleeing into the stars, leaving behind the world incomplete. But the seed had been sown. Mundus was real, flawed, fragile, beautiful, and Lorkhan smiled. For this was always the plan, not to destroy, but to challenge. Not to deceive, but to awaken. The world would test the spirits. And the mortals who came after, they would climb. They would fall. They would seek the divine. They would matter. But there was a price. The gods who remained looked upon Lorkhan with fury and grief. He had convinced them to give up their power, their place in eternity. Many cursed him. Some would try to destroy him. Others would canonize or demonize him. Names would change, legends would twist, but one truth would echo forever. It began with a question and a choice. In the beginning, there was only the Orbis, and then came Lorkhan. Lorkhan, they called him, the trickster, the fool, the creator, the betrayer. To speak his name in any era of Tamriel is to awaken debate. To some, he is a villain, an architect of sorrow, the father of mortal suffering. To others, he is the only true hero who dared challenge eternity so that time could begin. What cannot be denied is this. He gave the world its shape, and the world gave back silence. After the forging of Mundus, a rift grew among the spirits. The Aedra who remained were not what they had once been. Their divine essence had been spent, poured into the skeleton of the world. Some became what mortals would later call gods. Others, less fortunate, were bound to the bones of the earth, their names lost, their forms reshaped. They were the first spirits, Aedra, now mortal in their own way, trapped in time, unable to walk freely as before. Among those who stayed, few felt peace. Many turned upon Lorkhan, believing he had tricked them into their sacrifice. They saw his smile as cruel, his words as lies. Some whispered that Lorkhan knew the cost from the start, that he wanted the gods to fall so mortals could rise. Some claimed he never intended to join the sacrifice himself, and only posed as an equal builder. In the end, what mattered was not intent, but consequence. A meeting was called at convention, a place outside time where the remaining Aedra gathered. They demanded justice. The stars dimmed, the winds held their breath, and in this stillness, the gods decided Lorkhan's fate. They tore out his heart, a fragment of pure divinity, still pulsing with the idea of creation. It beat with a rhythm unlike any other, a whisper of possibility, a spark of rebellion. Some say it screamed, others say it sang. The gods, fearing its power, resolved to destroy it. But the heart would not die. They cast it down from the heavens, hurling it to Nirn like a falling star. It struck the world like a wound. The impact formed a crater, deep and sacred. There, buried beneath the red mountain of Vardenfell, the heart of Lorkhan remained, hidden, humming, waiting. It is said that when the heart struck Nirn, the world shifted. Mountains rose, seas churned, and the future began to twist in new directions. Elves would later name Lorkhan as a deceiver, calling him sure and cursing him for trapping them in flesh. Men would revere him as a god who gave them meaning. Nords would say he died a noble death, and his ghost still watches over the world. Each culture spun its tale, painted him with fear, reverence, or rage. But the heart remained. Those who sought it would never be the same. Even centuries later, whispers of its power would draw kings and sorcerers, betrayers and prophets. Some would seek to wield it, others to hide it. All would leave changed or broken. For the heart of Lorkhan did not forgive. It did not forget. It was not simply a relic. It was the world's first question, still unanswered. What does it mean to be mortal? This was the trickster's gift, a world of limitation, where mortals must wrestle with fate, with faith, with the unknowable. A world of pain, yes, but also of growth. Where courage matters because fear is real. Where love matters because time is short. Where death is certain and life, therefore, is priceless. Lorkhan gave them that. And for this, they called him mad. But perhaps madness is simply vision seen from the wrong end of time. The land of Morrowind, scorched by ash and shaped by gods, hold within it a wound too old to remember and too deep to heal. In the center of this land rises Red Mountain, the vast and restless volcano that looms like a guardian and a curse. Beneath its molten bones lies the buried remnant of a forgotten betrayal, the heart of Lorkhan, still beating with the secret fire of creation. Long before the Tribunal, long before the Empire, even before the Chimer called this place home, the heart pulsed in silence. There are no cities then, no mortals, only the bones of time settling into place, and the slow awareness of the gods that their eternity had ended. It was the Dwemer, the deep elves, who first dared to seek the heart again. The Dwemer were not like other elves. They did not worship. They did not kneel. They sought knowledge with a hunger sharp enough to cut reality. Logic was their scripture, metal their language. And in the deep veins of Nirn, they tunneled not just through stone, but through meaning. It was High Engineer Kagranak who uncovered the ancient legend of a divine relic buried beneath the mountain, the torn heart of a god, still alive, still powerful. The Dwemer, proud and godless, saw the heart not as a warning, but as a tool. Their ambition became legend, to harness the heart and transcend mortal bounds, not through faith, but through reason. To become immortal not as spirits, but as perfected beings of machine and will. They would build a god with their own hands, and they would call it Nemidium. And so began the forging. The tools of Kagranak, Keening, Asunder, and Wraithguard were crafted with precision beyond understanding. Each had a role in awakening the heart, binding it to their great golem. The mountain trembled, the sky dimmed, and deep in their great halls, the Dwemer whispered secrets no other race would ever grasp. But the Chimer, the golden-skinned elves of the land, watched with growing alarm. The Chimer revered their ancestors, their gods, and their destiny. To them, the Dwemer's pursuit was not brilliance, but blasphemy. The heart was sacred, and its manipulation unforgivable. Tensions between the two races flared, and war brewed beneath the red sky. This was the world that awaited the Tribunal. Vivek, Almalexia, and Sothis Sil, before they rose to power. And in this world, the Battle of Red Mountain would erupt. But before the swords clashed and destinies were rewritten, the heart itself remained still, timeless, and unknowable. Did it dream? Did it remember the hands that cast it down, the gods who feared it, the trickster who once wore it in his chest? Some say the heart was not merely power, but consciousness, that it held within it the thoughts of Lorkhan, buried deep, coiled tight like a sleeping serpent, that it called to those who came near, not with words, but with possibility. Those who heard it felt fate stir. Some would see visions, others would go mad, and yet still they came. For to possess the heart was to touch the divine, not in worship, but in becoming, to burn away the limits of mortality, to step beyond the cycle of birth and death. But Red Mountain does not give without price, and those who walk its paths leave something behind: sanity, soul, certainty. The Dwemer learned this, and when the final moment came, when Kagranak struck the heart with his tools and the mountain roared, the Dwemer vanished. All of them, in an instant. Across Tamriel, every Dwemer turned to dust. Only echoes remained. No one knows what Kagranak achieved. Some say they succeeded and ascended beyond reality. Others say the heart rejected them and erased them for their pride. The heart, buried still, said nothing. It merely pulsed, waiting. The sky was painted in smoke and ash. Red Mountain stirred from its long slumber, its breath rolling out in waves of sulfur and flame. Upon its darkened slopes, two great peoples prepared for war, not over land nor gold, but over something far older, the heart of God and the right to shape the world with its power. This was the Battle of Red Mountain, a moment that would echo through every era to come. The Chimer, golden-skinned and proud, marched beneath the banners of their living gods-to-be, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sothis Sil. Among them stood Nerevar, the Hortator, chosen of his people, whose voice could still armies and stir the stars to motion. His heart was pure, his loyalty bound to his people and his wife, Almalexia, and his closest friend, the brilliant Sothis Sil. And beside him, though more shadowed, marched Dagath Yuar. The Dwemer, ancient and brilliant, stood fortified within their subterranean strongholds, where brass and stone intertwined in unearthly harmony. Their leader, Dumak Dwarf King, was once a friend to Nerevar, but that friendship had withered. Kagranak's secret plans, the use of the heart in constructing the Numidium, had shattered what trust remained. At the summit of Red Mountain, under a sky torn by lightning and falling ash, the two armies met. Few accounts agree on what happened next. Truth bleeds into myth. Some say it was Nerevar who confronted Kagranak and demanded the tools, Keening, Sunder, and Wraithguard. Others say Dagath Yuar took them first, sealing the heart away in secrecy before the Tribunal could reach it. What is known as this, the Dwemer fell, whether by divine judgment, catastrophic error, or their own hubris. The deep elves vanished in a single breath. In one instant, their cities became tombs. No bodies, no screams, only dust, and the empty songs of machines left humming in the dark. The world changed in that silence. And in the aftermath, Nerevar lay dead. How he died is another question shrouded in fog. Some say it was his wounds. Others whispered darker things, that he was betrayed by those he trusted most, by Vivek, Almalexia, and Sothis Sil, that they craved the heart's power and silenced the only voice that might have restrained them. Regardless, the Chimer mourned. Their Hortator was gone. Their allies vanished. and something deep beneath the mountain pulsed with unclaimed divinity. It was then, with grief still fresh and power unguarded, that the Tribunal made their choice. They approached the heart, not as mortals, but as aspirants to godhood. Using Kagranak's tools, they tapped its divine fire. One by one, they reached into the unknown and pulled forth something new. Not the old gods of myth, but new ones, self-made, self-willed, reflections of the mortal will to ascend. From that moment on, they were no longer Chimer. The exposure to the heart twisted their forms. Their golden skin darkened to ashen gray. Their eyes burned red. Their people, too, were transformed, not just in flesh, but in culture, in spirit, in destiny. The Chimer became the Dwemer. And while their new gods ruled from Mournhold and the grand city of Vivek, one was left behind. Dagoth Uar, who did not die in the Battle of Believed, but lingered beneath Red Mountain, corrupted and changed. He too had touched the heart, but where the Tribunal sought control, Dagoth Uar became obsession. He did not see himself as mortal, nor as god, but as both and neither. For centuries, he slumbered, dreaming dreams filled with ash and fire. The heart pulsed, the mountain trembled, time drifted, and in the silence, the legacy of Red Mountain spread like a shadow across the eras. The Tribunal ruled as gods. The Dwemer endured in worship, fear, and awe. But under the ash, the truth festered. The Battle of Red Mountain had not truly ended. It had merely been paused. Its fire would return. Its gods would falter, and the echo of Nerevar would rise again. Beneath the smoldering heart of Red Mountain, in chambers older than memory, a dream began to stir. It was not a dream born of peace, nor one of gentle longing. It was a dream of power, of vengeance, and of godhood unrestrained. And in this dream, Dagoth Uar awakened. Centuries had passed since the Battle of Red Mountain. The world above had changed. The Chimer were now the Dwemer. The Tribunal sat as living gods, their images carved into stone and sung through the temples of Morrowind. But deep in the ash-choked tunnels of Red Mountain, the sixth house, the House Dagoth, was not dead. It waited. In the depths of his tomb fortress, Dagoth Uar opened his eyes. Once a mortal noble and counselor to Nerevar, Dagoth Uar was now something else. His soul, exposed to the divine power of the Heart of Lorkhan, had transformed over centuries of solitude. He had not perished, as the Tribunal believed. He had become unbound, and he remembered betrayal. Whether truth or madness, Dagoth Uar believed that Nerevar had been deceived and slain by the Tribunal, and that the heart had been stolen, a divine inheritance denied. To Dagoth Uar, he was not the villain of the tale. He was the last loyalist to truth, the final guardian of the heart, and the rightful god of Morrowind. As he rose from slumber, so too did the ancient machines of the Dwemer, long dormant. Animunculi flickered to life, powered by deep magics and lost science. The halls of Red Mountain, once silent, thrummed with unnatural energy. The heart continued to beat, echoing through the black stone like a second pulse in the bones of Nirn. Dagoth Uar's awakening was not loud. It was subtle, like smoke through cracks or whispers in a temple. He reached first into dreams, sending his will into the sleeping minds of mortals. The dreamers were the first to hear his call. At first, they were dismissed as mad. Babbling of the sixth house, they wandered the coasts and cities, spreading his gospel. But they were not mad. They were chosen. They would become his voice, his flesh, his army. The corpus disease, a twisted, divine affliction, began to spread. Those touched by it were reshaped by Dagoth Uar's power, becoming monstrous, immortal, and loyal. Not alive, not dead, but somewhere in between. His new children. In secret, the sixth house returned. Hidden shrines rose beneath ash and ruin. Caves became sanctuaries of worship. Red candles flickered in places untouched by sunlight. Dagoth Uar's name was whispered again, not in reverence, but in warning, and the Tribunal felt it. Their divine connection, once so absolute, began to falter. The Heart of Lorkhan, though still bound by the tools they used, now responded to another will. The tribunal gods had taken from it. Dagoth Uar had become of it. He no longer desired to destroy the tribunal. He would replace them, not just as ruler of Morrowind, but as the sole divine force in Tamriel. Dagoth Uar's dream was not vengeance. It was unity. A singular god, a singular will, all beings joined through divine flesh and dream. Morrowind as the heart of a new world. A better world born of his vision, and all who opposed it would be cleansed. The dreamers multiplied. The blight storms gathered. The mountain growled. And far to the south, unaware, a stranger stepped ashore. A prisoner, carried by fate toward an old prophecy and an ancient enemy reborn. Dagoth Uar was no longer asleep. The mountain had awakened, and with it, the final age of gods and ghosts would begin. Ash swept across the grazelands and the bitter coast, carried on silent winds from the throat of Red Mountain. It did not roar. It drifted soft as breath. But within its haze, change was taking root. Not sudden, not loud. A creeping rebirth, shrouded in dreams and forgotten names. The Sixth House was returning. Where once there had been noble manors and grand estates, now there were tombs, ash-blown ruins haunted by shadows of ambition. Yet beneath these lost places, Dagoth Uar's faithful stirred. Not in armies, not yet, but in cells. Quiet sanctuaries formed beneath Morrowind's skin, hidden in grottos, buried in caves, disguised as ruins left to rot. And at their heart, the dreamers. These were not soldiers. They were pilgrims. They had seen visions in sleep, visions of fire and unity, of golden skin and a voice that came without words. Some were mad, others serene. All of them were marked by Dagoth Uar's touch. They wandered Vardenfell barefoot and silent, murmuring songs in forgotten tongues, eyes hollow, yet shining with purpose. They were calling others, and some answered. The blight winds grew stronger with time. Once thought to be rare storms, they now came with seasonal certainty. Scholars at the Tribunal Temple offered theories, corrupt magics, shifts in the flow of magicka, the slow revenge of the mountain. But truth hid in the wind. Dagoth Uar was breathing through the land. His corruption did not spread with violence at first. It came gently, like incense smoke curling around candlelight. Dreams twisted, bodies weakened. Infected minds wandered away from home and into the wild places. Some never returned. Others returned, changed. The disease known as corpus was no ordinary affliction. It was a divine contagion. It rewrote flesh. It whispered to bone. And those who bore it became vessels, not of death, but of immortality, grotesque and radiant in their suffering. They were not pitted in the Sixth House. They were celebrated. The dreamers saw corpus not as curse, but as initiation, a sacred fire that burned away the weak and left only the worthy. In the blighted halls beneath Red Mountain, these new followers became builders, priests, prophets. Flesh melded to stone. Blood ran thick with magicka. The line between body and structure blurred. The house was no longer dead. It was being rebuilt cell by cell. And the heart of Lorkhan pulsed louder. Even the Tribunal, godlike in their vigilance, began to feel unease. Almalexia's sermons grew more urgent. Vivek's writings became cryptic, filled with metaphors of shifting dreams and breaking mirrors. Soothe still remained silent, retreating further into the Clockwork City. The gods who once reshaped Morrowind now looked inward, afraid. They could no longer ignore what stirred beneath the ash. Artifacts of power, once sealed, were being unearthed. Tools of the Dwemer, long buried, were reclaimed by Dagoth Uar's minions. Keening, Asunder, and Wraithguard, names spoken in whispers, connected to the divine tools once used to tap the heart. It became clear. Dagoth Uar did not only remember the past. He was remaking it. His brothers, the other members of the ancient House Dagoth, returned as well, reborn as ash vampires, no longer mortal, no longer bound to time. They served as generals, oracles, and high priests in this new Sixth House. Each bore a part of Dagath Yuar's will. Each stood as a pillar in the rising temple of Blight, and all of it remained hidden from the wider world. For now, the rest of Tamriel carried on, unaware of the cancer growing in Morrowind's heart. But the prophecies of the Nerevarine stirred once more. Temple seers dreamed of a prisoner, a forgotten soul, a star reborn beneath shadow. They feared that prophecy, and so declare it heresy. But destiny moves in quiet arcs. Dagath Yuar's house was no longer lost. It was reborn in ash, flesh, and forgotten dreams. And in time, the world would remember its name. In the high sanctums of Mournhold, where marble domes catch the light of twin moons, the gods walked among mortals. At least, that was the belief. The Tribunal, three made divine through the Heart of Lorkhan, had ruled not just through might, but through worship. Almalexia, Sothis Sil, and Vivek, guardians, sages, and gods to the Dwemer people. Yet even gods feel the tremor of forgotten truths rising. In the years after Dagath Yuar's disappearance, the Tribunal ruled unchallenged. Their words were scripture, their deeds legend. Cities blossomed under their watchful presence. Pilgrims traveled from ashlands to the inner sea, seeking wisdom at the feet of the divine. But under the ash-covered earth, the very source of their divinity had begun to resist them. The Heart of Lorkhan, once subdued by the tools of Kagranak, pulsed now with something ancient and angry. They felt it first as dreams, flickers of old guilt, echoes of betrayal, and shadows of Nerevar's voice. Almalexia dismissed them as the burdens of wisdom. Vivek turned them into poetry, dancing around the truth. But Sothis Sil, ever the quiet one, knew what they meant. The heart was stirring, and with it, the sleeping god Dagath Yuar. To maintain their power, the Tribunal had long made pilgrimages to the heart beneath Red Mountain. There, with Keening and Asunder, they would draw from its divine source. But now, the paths were no longer safe. The tunnels echoed with whispers. Shadows moved with intent. Dreams bled into waking. They were not alone anymore. Their last pilgrimage ended in failure. Deep beneath the earth, Dagath Yuar had returned, now a god in his own right, nourished by the same source they once stole. He stood not as a forgotten ally, but as a rival, a reflection of their guilt, ambition, and loss. He denied them access. Worse, he repelled them. The gods returned to Mournhold, and Vivek's city diminished. Not visibly, but spiritually. Their light flickered. Their silence grew. Almalexia's sermons turned stern. Where once she offered comfort, now she warned of heresy and disobedience. Her voice, once the balm of the faithful, became sharp. Temples increased their vigilance. Priests became enforcers. Questions were met with fire. Sothis Sil withdrew completely, retreating to the Clockwork City, his hidden realm of gears and stars. There, he sought solace not in divinity, but in calculation. He mapped futures, studied timelines, and sought patterns in prophecy. Yet even his machines hummed uneasily, as if reality itself was coming apart at the seams. Vivek, the warrior poet, remained in his city. He offered riddles and scripture, often contradicting himself, as if attempting to rewrite destiny by confusing those who followed it. His sermons became increasingly esoteric, paradoxes layered on metaphors, poetry masking regret. And in his quietest hours, he stared northward toward Red Mountain, toward his failure. The people of Morrowind noticed the change. Some only whispered, others questioned aloud. Why had the gods ceased their pilgrimages? Why did the winds carry more blight? Why did Corpus spread unchecked in distant villages? Why did the temple respond not with healing, but with exile? Prophets began to speak again of the Nerevarine, the prophesied rebirth of Endoral Nerevar, who would return to cast down false gods. The temple declared such talk heretical, but even the most devout could feel the tension in the air, as if the gods themselves were holding their breath. And beneath Red Mountain, Dagath Yuar watched. He knew their weakness now. Time, regret, and silence had eroded them more than any blade. He had no need for armies, only patience. The Tribunal was breaking from within. Their splendor remained, but their soul had begun to fade. Once, they had dared reshape the fate of the Chimer people. Now, they struggled to maintain the illusion of divinity. And the heart of Lorkhan pulsed on, impartial, eternal. It had given power to gods, and it could just as easily take it away. The Tribunal, Almalexia, Vivek, and soothe were once united by purpose, by vision, by a shared betrayal that birthed their godhood. But as the divine threads that sustained their rule frayed, so too did the bond that held them together. Divinity, it seemed, did not shield them from fear. It only prolonged its arrival. Each god felt the shift in their own realm. Mournhold no longer echoed with the same confidence. Almalexia's steps grew heavier, though she still wore the mask of serenity. Her sermons were filled with light, but they burned now, not warmed. The Queen of Mercy, who once healed with a glance, had become a guardian of silence, silencing dissent, silencing doubt, silencing memory. Soothe was further still. He had not spoken to mortals in years. Some whispered he had become more machine than man. His clockwork city, hidden far from time and space, reflected his growing detachment. He did not weep, did not rage, but his machines did. The gears turned with uncertain rhythm. The cog shuddered. Prophecies once charted in gleaming metal now blurred and distorted. Even the future, it seemed, was no longer certain. And then there was Vivek, the warrior poet, the enigmatic god who danced through paradox and sermon. He alone remained among the people, his city built as a shrine to both devotion and riddle. But even Vivek, the golden tongue, began to falter. He no longer spoke of the future with confidence. His sermons grew inward, folding on themselves. He began to write of guilt, in veiled words, of course, cloaked in metaphor, but unmistakable all the same. He wrote of a spear held too long, of a friend betrayed beneath the Red Mountain, of a god who never asked to be won. The fear they shared was unspoken, but it was the same. The heart was fading, slipping from their grasp. Without its power, they could not maintain their divinity. And more than power, it was their identity. They had not been mortals in thousands of years. To lose their godhood was to lose themselves. And Daggeth you are, no longer dead, no longer mortal, knew this well. He whispered across the ash fields, not in words but in dreams. His influence began to seep through the edges of waking thought. Pilgrims returning from Red Mountain told of voices in their sleep, of strange visions, of promises whispered by a deep and ancient hunger. Some went mad. Others were changed. The blight winds carried not just disease, but invitation. Join me, the dreams said. Come to the true God. And still, the Tribunal remained silent. They could not confront Daggeth you are, not with certainty, not with strength. The heart that once united them now fed their enemy. He was what they had feared, a reminder of what they were and what they were not. Their own followers began to sense the shift. The temple doubled its decrees, forbidding pilgrimage to Red Mountain. Heretics were cast out. Dissidents were branded. But fear, once planted, is hard to weed out. It grows even in silence, especially in silence. Almalexia sought control. She surrounded herself with loyalists, her eyes sharper, her voice louder. Her compassion, once legendary, hardened into judgment. She punished uncertainty with doctrine. She held power as tightly as she held her staff. And yet, she could not quell the unease in her court. There were fewer miracles, fewer blessings. The faithful prayed harder, but the answers came slower. Soothe still did not return to council. He sent no word. Rumors swirled. Had he gone mad? Had he built a machine that could replace the gods themselves? Or had he foreseen the end and simply chosen to watch it from afar? Vivek remained the pivot, half man, half god, half truth. His writings hinted at hope, then despair, then detachment. He knew what was coming. In his quiet hours, he wrote of the Nerevarine, the reborn hero destined to challenge them all. A destiny too long denied. He did not resist it. Perhaps he even welcomed it. The gods, after all, had once been liars in the skin of saints. and yet they still loved their people. That was the cruelest truth. Almalexia, who ruled with fire, still saw herself as protector. Soothe Sil, in his machine womb of brass and stars, believed he was saving the world from itself. Vivek, caught between guilt and grandeur, longed to preserve something of beauty, even if it was not himself. They were gods trembling not from defeat, but from memory. The memory of who they had been. Of Nerevar, of the oath beneath Red Mountain, of a heart stolen and a destiny denied. Dagoth Yuar, patient and eternal, knew that fear, and it was his greatest weapon. The wind over Red Mountain no longer whispered. It howled. It screamed. It spoke in tongues known only to the forgotten and the broken. The blight had returned, not merely as a disease of the flesh, but as a corruption of soul, memory, and meaning. And through it moved the will of Dagoth Yuar. In the ash-choked valleys of Vardenfell, villagers began to vanish. Crops withered. Beasts, once timid, grew fierce and twisted. Quama workers abandoned their hives. Scribs turned violent. Cliff racers circled lower, more daring. Even the air thickened, clotting lungs with invisible ruin. And in dreams, people heard the same voice, a low, beckoning him that neither condemned nor comforted. It simply waited. The blight was no longer nature. It was intention. It flowed from the heart like a river of rot, its current drawing minds toward Dagoth Yuar's dominion. A land of thought turned to nightmare. And yet, within that corruption was order. A design. A calling. The sixth house had returned. It began subtly. Ash statues appeared in homes across Morrowind. Ornate, inert, and eerie. Gifts from no one. Priests warned against them. Temples forbade their use. But curiosity and something more, something deeper, compelled the people to keep them. They did not know why, only that it felt important, sacred, comforting, even as it unsettled. And so the dreams grew clearer. You are called. You are chosen. You are remembered. Men and mare vanished in the night. Entire Asunder camps disappeared. Townsfolk woke to find their neighbors gone, their homes left undisturbed, doors unlocked, meals half-eaten. Some returned, changed, eyes hollow, skin sallow, speaking in riddles, bowing to altars of dust and blood. They called themselves sleepers, and they had been touched by Dagoth Yuar's mind. The temple tried to respond. Ordinators marched with purpose. Shrines were purified, but for every statue they destroyed, more appeared. For every cultist they arrested, more rose in their place. And some of the infected could not die. Swords pierced them, fire burned them, but still they stood, smiling, whispering. Becomes. The blight storms worsened. They rolled down from Red Mountain in great, rust-colored clouds that blotted out the sun. Even gods held their breath. Almalexia, desperate, declared new restrictions. Vivek prayed in silence, high atop his cantons. Soothe still remained hidden, but the Nerevarine had already begun to walk the land. A mortal, unknown and unknowing, born under a shrouded prophecy, began to stir the long still waters of fate. This figure, though unnamed in prophecy, was marked by divine design, or perhaps by the heart itself. The temple denied the claim. The people were uncertain, but the blight had made them desperate. Shrines whispered the name Nerevar again, and this time, not in reverence, but in hope. The Ashlanders, keepers of oral memory, watched closely. They had long rejected the Tribunal's false divinity. To them, the return of the Sixth House was not a crisis. It was a reckoning, a fulfillment of words passed down in secret, prophecies sealed in ash and shadow. They remembered the betrayal at Red Mountain. They remembered how Nerevar's oath had been broken. They remembered the stolen heart. But they did not yet know if this reborn hero would be their salvation or their doom. Meanwhile, the Sixth House grew stronger. Beneath the mountains, deep in forgotten tombs and Daedric ruins, Dagoth Yuar's lieutenants stirred. Ash vampires, once kin to gods, now monsters molded by the heart's radiance, guarded ancient strongholds. They whispered commands through the blight. They dreamed with their master. And through the dreams, they saw the Tribunal tremble. Dagath did not act quickly. He had learned patience in his long death. He allowed the fear to grow roots. He allowed doubt to blossom. He let the people see the weakness of the gods. He offered no army, no decree, only dreams. And in a world ruled by crumbling faith, dreams were stronger than laws. A quiet rebellion bloomed in shadows. It did not bear banners. It did not raise swords. It simply waited for its God to rise. Come to me. That was the message. You are forgiven. That was the lie. In the hallowed halls of the Tribunal temple, the air no longer carried reverence. It clung to the stone like regret. Pilgrims still came, still knelt, still prayed. But their prayers were quieter now, tinged with unease. For the world was changing, and even the gods seemed unsure of what waited beyond the horizon. Vivek's sermons no longer echoed with the same confidence. His poetry, once luminous with divine riddles and profound self-love, turned introspective, almost melancholy. His people sensed it, though none dared speak it aloud. The gods were faltering, not because of power, but because of memory, because of truth. The truth, once buried beneath layers of myth and sanctified propaganda, had begun to rise like steam from the molten belly of Red Mountain. The truth of Nerevar, a betrayal of the heart. The Tribunal had taken the power of a god from the Heart of Lorkhan, but they had also taken something else. Trust. They had rewritten the past, woven themselves into legends they did not earn, and convinced the nation to worship masks in place of memory. And now, memory had returned with the ash. In the deep places, Dagath whispered not only power, but revelation. He called the Tribunal false gods. And, most dangerous of all, he was not entirely wrong. The Ashlanders, long scorned and mocked as heretics, began to speak louder. They pointed to the storms, to the blight, to the failing gods. Their wise women dusted off old verses. Prophets walked again beneath the stars, speaking of Nerevar reborn, not as a tool of the Tribunal, but as a reclaimer, one who would tear down the false pantheon and restore what had been taken. Among the people of Vardenfell, doubt festered like a wound. Some clung tighter to faith. Others, quietly, began to look to the mountains, not in fear, but in anticipation. For in the crumbling of the Tribunal's sanctity, something old was stirring, a sense of wrongness being made right. Almalexia, ever proud and ever burning, responded with fire. She declared the heresies punishable by death. She strengthened the ordinators. Temples were purged. Shrines to Dagath were smashed. Ashlander camps were raided in the name of divine purity. But every act of aggression only confirmed the whispers, only strengthened the myth of the returning hero. Soothe, distant and detached, remained cloistered in his clockwork realm. Perhaps he knew the truth could not be stopped. Perhaps he saw what others did not, that the heart song was nearing its final note. And Vivek, he watched, he calculated, and in his silence was an admission more powerful than confession. Even the gods remembered the lie. Meanwhile, the sleepers, the voices of the sixth house, began to act. They infiltrated cities, posing as beggars, healers, mystics. They carried no weapons, only words, only ideas. And in a society weary from plague and prophecy, ideas were as sharp as any blade. They spoke of unity, of ancient glory, of a future where gods did not pretend. They promised a world unchained from false hierarchies, ruled instead by the divine will of Dagath no longer a villain, but a father returned. And so, the great paradox emerged. A monster who told the truth, and gods who once lied to save their people. What is a false god if the faith was once genuine? What is a tyrant if he tells the truth? In the heart of this moral quagmire stood the Nerevarine, still unnamed, still uncertain. Their path was shadowed by contradiction. They were sent to destroy Dagath but to do so, they had to ally with the gods who betrayed him. Their destiny was to fulfill prophecy. But whose prophecy? The temple's sanitized version? Or the Ashlanders' raw and painful truth? Every step forward was not just physical, but philosophical. And the closer the Nerevarine came to Red Mountain, the louder the echoes became. Echoes of betrayal, echoes of pain, echoes of a man once named Nerevar, whose bones still haunted the dust. Daggith Yuar, through the dreams of the afflicted, made his case not as a destroyer, but as the betrayed. He offered redemption, reunion, purpose, and some, hearing his call, believed him. They did not see a god rising. They saw justice returning. In these days, Morrowind held its breath. The Tribunal still held their thrones, but the foundation had cracked. The people still sang their hymns, but the melodies faltered. And high above, in the choking ash of Red Mountain, a new kind of dawn loomed, not of light, but of decision. For all things false must eventually fall, and all things forgotten eventually awaken. The wind on Red Mountain no longer whispered. It screamed, carrying with it memories scorched into ash and bone. As the Nerevarine drew closer to the summit, the world seemed to slow, as if time itself hesitated, unwilling to watch what came next. There was something ancient in the air, something older than empires, older even than gods. It was memory, raw and unfiltered, still hot from the fire of betrayal. Every step through the waste was haunted, not by ghosts in the traditional sense, but by fragments, shattered recollections of a people and a purpose lost to time. Asunder camps lay half-abandoned, their seers in trance, speaking riddles through cracked lips. Blighted creatures stalked the land like symptoms of a wound left untreated. The sky darkened with soot, and the stars above seemed to blink slower, as though dimming out of reverence or dread. The Nerevarine, unnamed but not unknown, moved like a figure from prophecy, both burdened and buoyed by it. The words of the dissident priests rang in their mind. The verses of the Ashlanders echoed with each heartbeat. And the sermons of Vivek, once a comfort, now felt like puzzles with missing pieces. Who was telling the truth? Or perhaps more importantly, whose truth mattered now? The Heart of Lorkhan, though hidden deep beneath Red Mountain, pulsed in the dreams of Tamriel like a drumbeat. It called not just to Daggith Yuar, not only to the Tribunal, but to the world itself. Every war, every shrine, every godly claim, so much of it traced back to that one act. The tearing of Lorkhan's heart from his chest, the scattering of his divine remains across Nirn, and the great mystery that followed. Was it punishment or purpose? In Velothai ruins, ancient inscriptions flared to life as the Nerevarine passed. Images of Chimer priests and Dwemer architects loomed from the walls. Murals showed the moment the heart was discovered, hidden in the deep earth, beating still with divine rhythm. Here, at the intersection of betrayal and invention, the Tribunal claimed godhood, and the Dwemer vanished. But there were no clear answers, only echoes. The past refused to explain itself plainly. It spoke in visions, in madness, in half-remembered truths wrapped in metaphors. Even the heart, source of divinity and doom, remained silent to questions of morality. Was Lorkhan's sacrifice noble, as some said, a gift of mortality so that souls could grow? Or was it deception, a trick played on the other gods, forcing the burden of existence upon them? In either version, his heart had become a relic of contention, and now its power rippled outward, destabilizing all who touched it. The Nerevarine was no longer just a figure of prophecy. They were a crucible, a mirror held up to the gods and the damned alike. Daggith Yuar, dreaming madly in his fortress of dust and shadow, believed himself a savior. The Tribunal, each in their own faltering way, clung to their divinity not just for power, but out of fear of what it meant to be mortal again. And so, the mountain became a symbol, not merely of danger or disease, but of reckoning. Vivek's voice returned to the Nerevarine through dreams. Not commands, not decrees, just verses almost mournful. I remember red. I remember gold. I remember a friend's hand reaching for the heart. Whether these were admissions or distractions, the Nerevarine could not tell. Soothe still remained silent. Whatever revelations he'd uncovered within the Clockwork City, he had long ceased to share them. And Almalexia's anger, sharp as a blade, pulsed in the temple corridors like a storm waiting to break. But none of them could stop what was coming. Red Mountain loomed not as a battlefield, but as a tomb, as a temple, as a theater. It had seen gods rise and would now see them fall. Beneath its crust, the heart waited, not with intent, not with malice, but with inevitability. Ashes are what remain when everything else burns away. And from those ashes, memory rises. The Nerevarine approached not as a hero, not even as a chosen one, but as a question made flesh. Who owns the past? And who, in the end, must carry it? The Nerevarine stood at the threshold of the impossible, a place where myth and material blurred into one. Beneath the mountain's heart, the heart itself beat, not like the organ of a man, nor like the quiet ticking of a machine. No, this was something older, a divine rhythm, woven into the stone and spirit of Nirn itself. It throbbed through the walls. It echoed in the bones. Every breath was taken in counterpoint to it. The chamber was not just a cavern. It was a sanctum, a place where time dissolved and the soul stood bare. The heart pulsed above the stone, suspended in air like a dying star, radiating light that was not light, some fusion of thought, power, memory, and sorrow. It was beautiful in a way that made one's spine tremble, ancient in a way that made language feel pointless. Nearby, Kagranak's tools, Keening, Sunder, and Wraithguard, rested like instruments waiting for their final player. They were relics of mortal genius, forged to touch the divine. Tools meant not only to channel the heart's power, but to reshape it. The Dwemer, who had reached for eternity and vanished in a myth, had left behind their question unanswered. What happens when you try to change the will of the universe? The Tribunal had once used these tools to become gods, and yet even their reign had eroded, as all thrones do. Their divinity, pulled from the heart's rhythm, had been a flame lit on borrowed wick. Now, it flickered in the wind of fate, and Daggeth Uar, old friend, new god, mad prophet, had taken the same source and twisted it inward, until all he saw was himself. He waited just ahead, cloaked in shadow, crowned in ash. His voice, when it came, was a thunder layered over whispers. He did not speak as a man, nor even as a god, but as something more elemental, like a mountain's grief or a storm's dream. "You came," he said. "You who were once friend, now become the end. Do you know what you are? A tool, like the others? Or are you something more?" The Nerevarine answered with silence, not out of fear, but reverence. What words could explain what was unfolding? Daggeth Uar raged. He pleaded. He prophesied. He remembered. Memories of Nerevar, of betrayals real or imagined, of the moment the gods were made and the moment he was left behind. His was not the madness of chaos. It was the madness of unbearable memory, of knowing too much, of holding onto a dream for too long. He offered alliance, then warning, then fury. But none of it mattered anymore. The heart pulsed, not in approval, not in defiance, simply because it must. The moment arrived. The tools were lifted. Power met purpose. There was no explosion, no final scream. Only a silence so complete it seemed to fold space inward. A quiet more profound than any sermon. And when the silence ended, Daggeth Uar was no more. The heart, pierced, began to fade. Not instantly. Slowly, like a sun choosing to dim. Its beat slowed, then trembled, then stopped. The cavern around it groaned, not collapsing, but weeping. A divine withdrawal. The undoing of what had once been stolen. Godhood bled from the Tribunal. Vivek felt it even from afar, writing verses with shaking hands. Almalexia would feel it in days to come, her fury unchained by divinity's absence. And Soothe still, perhaps he had already known. Perhaps, in his deep silence, he had prepared for this moment long ago. And the Nerevarine? They stood in the fading glow. Not exalted, not broken, simply changed. The echoes of prophecy had fulfilled themselves. But like all fulfilled prophecies, they left behind only questions. Was this victory? Or merely transition? Was the world safer? or more exposed. There was no triumphant cry, no fanfare, only the whisper of ash, the hiss of wind over stone, the distant murmur of the red mountain sleeping once more. Outside, the skies over Vardenfell shifted subtly. The blight winds began to weaken. The land, long sickened, felt a tremor of relief. The people would tell stories, of course, of heroes and gods, of betrayal and redemption. But none would truly understand what had been done, because this was not the end of a god. It was the end of an era. The Heart of Lorkhan was gone. Not destroyed, just released. Its pulse, once bound to ambition and fear, now free to fade back into the fabric of Mundus. The Nerevarine walked away, not into glory, but into legend. And the mountain, once a crucible of power, stood still. For the first time in millennia, it was quiet. The Tribunal temple stood in uneasy silence, its sanctuary still perfumed with incense that now felt out of place. No sermons rang through its hallowed halls, no echo of poetic blessings, no rhythmic chants of worship. Only the wind whispered through stone corridors, as if the very breath of the gods had been exhaled and not returned. Word of the Heart's severance spread slowly at first, like the ripples of a fallen pebble in a sacred pond. But soon, the truth could no longer be hidden, even by the most devout priests. The Tribunal, those once living gods of Morrowind, were no longer divine. Their connection to the Heart had been their source, their truth, their radiance. Now that source had faded, leaving behind only the weight of belief and the ghost of power. In the high fane of Vivec, the priests and ordinators gathered in confusion and fear. Some refused to believe it. Others collapsed in prayer, trying to reach their vanished gods. But the divine light they once felt no longer answered. The architecture of their faith still stood, tall and proud, but the soul of it had fled. The books remained. The sermons still spoke of mercy, mastery, and mystery. But the names carved in gold began to feel hollow. The pilgrims who once climbed to Vivec's palace in reverent silence now hesitated at its base, unsure if they were approaching a god or just a memory. And above it all, the sky held no answers, no signs, only the quiet turn of time. Almalexia, ever the flame of devotion and passion, did not take the loss in silence. Within the domes of Mournhold, she raged, not as a goddess betrayed, but as a ruler wounded. Her pride had not faded with her power. To her, divinity had been not just truth, but duty. And now, that mantle had slipped from her shoulders, leaving her only with questions and fury. She became more unpredictable, more erratic. Her sermons more forceful, her punishments more cruel. Where faith had once sustained her, desperation now drove her. Vivec, meanwhile, did not rage. He withdrew. Within his sprawling city, half floating, half submerged, he retreated into solitude. The warrior poet turned his gaze inward, poring over his own words as if they might reveal a hidden meaning he had missed. He wrote less of divinity and more of myth, of echoes, of what remains when gods go quiet. He did not mourn his loss, at least not outwardly. He had always known this moment might come. In truth, he had waited for it. For the end of the lie, or the truth finally told. And in the silence of his fading power, he found something almost akin to peace. The people of Morrowind were left adrift in the wake of this slow unraveling. 4 generations, the Tribunal had been the heart of their world. More than rulers, more than gods, they had been symbols of unity, of destiny, of protection in a world full of chaos and dragons and Aedra. Now, with their gods faltering, the Dwemer had to ask the hardest questions. Who are we without them? What do we believe when the divine turns mortal again? Some turn to older paths, the worship of the good Aedra, long suppressed but never forgotten. Others turn to new philosophies, to ancestors, to ash and earth. The dissident priests, once hunted, now stepped into daylight, not in triumph, but in sorrowful affirmation. They had spoken the truth for years, and now that truth no longer needed words. Even among the common folk, change whispered like wind through the nettle. Pilgrimages slowed. Altars grew dusty. The Tribunal statues still stood, but their gaze no longer pierced the veil between worlds. They were now relics, not conduits. And yet, not all faith was lost. Some still believed, not in power, but in legacy. They said the Tribunal had done what they must, in a time when the world teetered. That godhood had been a burden, not a crown. That without Vivek's wisdom, Almalexia's protection, and Sothis vision, Morrowind would have fallen long ago. These were not blind followers, but thoughtful ones. Those who could separate the myth from the message, the divinity from the deed. In the end, the Tribunal's fall was not like the shattering of a crystal, but like the melting of a candle. Gradual, inevitable, a light that once lit the world slowly dimmed until it became memory. And memory, for the Dwemer, is sacred. The Tribunal, once radiant in glory and flame, were now shadows cast against the walls of a crumbling temple. What had begun as a pact, noble or blasphemous depending on who told the tale, had unraveled into sorrow. As the divine light left them, so too did their unshakable purpose. Now they were not gods, but legends flickering in the fading dusk. Almalexia, the Mother of Mercy, could not accept this descent. Her divine persona had been forged not only in the power of the heart, but in her unwavering certainty that she alone could shield her people. Mournhold, once a city of learning and reverence, became a palace of isolation and fear. She surrounded herself with echoes, relics of the past, servile followers, statues whose empty eyes reflected back her growing madness. To lose godhood was not just to lose power, it was to lose identity. For Almalexia, who had spoken prophecy, healed wounds with a whisper, and stood against Daedric incursions without blinking, the fading of her divinity was an unraveling of self. And so, she clung to what remained. Control, authority. Her voice, once filled with benevolence, became sharp and accusatory. Where once she had offered guidance, now she issued decrees. Doubt, especially when whispered by the dissident priests, was met not with debate, but silence enforced by blades. Yet the people changed around her. Fear, once masked as reverence, began to feel heavier. The murals of her triumphs looked too polished, too perfect. Her temple, once a place of healing, now carried an atmosphere of judgment. Whispers grew in Mournhold, quiet, yes, but growing. Something was breaking, and everyone felt it. Sothis, by contrast, did not rage. His absence was his answer. The Clockwork City, his vast, unknowable world of logic, gears, and serene madness, remained sealed. No messages, no declarations. It was said he had already accepted the end long ago, that his mind, brilliant beyond reckoning, had foreseen the collapse of the Tribunal's era and had quietly recused himself. Some even believed he had died, lost within the very mechanisms he created. Others said he had transcended the need for gods, or bodies, or even time. But no soul could say for certain. The silence of Soothe still became both metaphor and reality. And silence has a weight of its own. Without his voice in the divine triad, the balance of power shifted. Almalexia grew more frantic. Vivek more still. Vivek, the warrior poet, the enigma, responded not with authority or wrath, but with distance. He no longer walked the streets of his city. His sermons stopped. His letters ceased. The people wondered if he had simply faded away like smoke from a long, cold fire. In truth, Vivek withdrew not from the world, but from worship. It was said he spent his days in contemplation, staring into the waters surrounding his temple palace, reflecting on the lies he had told and the truths he had woven. He had always been self-aware, perhaps too much so. He understood that godhood, like poetry, required belief. With that belief unraveling, he did not fight the end, but studied it. For Vivek, this was not just the fall of a god. It was the closing stanza of a poem centuries in the making. Among the Dwemer, this unraveling of their sacred triad sent ripples through every aspect of life. The great houses grew restless. The Tribunal Temple, once the central pillar of society, now wavered in its authority. Pilgrimages dwindled. The tribunal's names still passed between lips, but now with hesitation, like a song remembered in grief, not celebration. And yet, in the ashes of godhood, a strange kind of clarity began to grow. People remembered that before the tribunal, there had been ancestors, that beneath the shining temples and floating cantons, the soul of Morrowind had always been its people, its land, its resilience. Worship shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly. Ancestor veneration returned in quiet corners. The old Daedra, Bothia, Mephala, and Azura whispered back into the hearts of those who once feared to invoke their names. Azura, especially, seemed to rise again, not as a vengeful goddess, but as a quiet, knowing presence. The moon and star that had long prophesied the fall of the tribunal now gleamed in twilight skies, as if to say, "It is done." Not all mourned the tribunal's fall. To some, it was liberation, proof that the mortal should never mimic the divine. That power drawn from theft, even in the name of protection, always exacts a price. The Heart of Lorkhan had offered them a shortcut to godhood, but had also bound them to a destiny that could not sustain itself. In the end, their divinity burned too bright, too long. And like all great fires, they left behind smoke and ash. The tribunal's legacy would live on, not in golden shrines or sermons, but in the complicated, living memory of a people who had loved, feared, and ultimately outlived their gods. In the absence of divine intervention, the Dwemer were forced to find their strength again, not in the heavens, but in the earth. And in that, perhaps, there was something sacred after all. When a god vanishes, the world does not shake. The stars do not fall. The oceans do not rise. What lingers is silence, a stillness where once there was certainty. Such was the state of Morrowind when Vivec disappeared. There was no proclamation, no final sermon, nor radiant burst of divine light. One day, the warrior poet was simply gone. His temple, floating serenely above the cantons of Vivec City, remained still. Pilgrims arrived, knelt, prayed, and heard nothing in return. The sermons, once etched into the stone and soul of Morrowind, became relics. His words, once alive with riddles and rhythm, now hung in the air like dust. Some believed he had died in contemplation, consumed by the weight of his own contradictions. Others whispered that he had ascended once again, becoming one with the fabric of the world, just as he claimed to have once existed before time. A few clung to hope that he walked among them in disguise, offering quiet wisdom to those still listening. But truth, like Vivec himself, remained elusive. The tribunal was no more. With the vanishing of Vivec, the divine trinity had fully dissolved. Soothe still had died in silence. Almalexia had fallen to madness and steel. Now Vivec, the last light of the tribunal, faded into legend. The age of living gods had ended, not with thunder or fire, but with stillness. A cultural breath held too long, now finally exhaled. The people of Morrowind, so long cradled by divine presence, were forced to reckon with their own reflection. What does it mean to worship gods who were once mortal? Who lied? Who bled? Who ruled and faltered? Faith, so intricately woven into Dunmery identity, became less a flame and more a flickering memory. The Tribunal Temple, its great spires darkened and its doctrines in doubt, began to lose its grip. The dissident priests, once hunted and silenced, now walked freely. The old ways stirred beneath ash-covered soil. The Daedric triad, Bothia, Mephala, Azura, were whispered to once more, not just in secret shrines, but in public halls. It was not a return to old gods with triumph or fanfare, but with humility, not to reclaim divine favor, but to remember where the Dwemer had begun. Veneration shifted from towering idols to quiet ancestor shrines. The wisdom of grandmothers, the strength of lost warriors, the names etched into family tombs. These became sacred once more. The people turned inward, and in doing so, found solace. In place of divine instruction, there grew community. In place of imposed ritual, a new kind of reverence, one built not on perfection, but on endurance. The architecture of Morrowind began to mirror this change. Shrines once clad in gold were left to weather, their edges softened by time and wind. City streets, once echoing with temple chants, now pulsed with the voices of guilds, traders, and thinkers. The Tribunal's images faded from murals, their names less spoken, their deeds debated instead of celebrated. But they were not forgotten. Vivek's sermons still lined library shelves, studied by mystics and scholars alike. Soothe machines continued to tick deep in the hidden recesses of Nirn, their purpose unclear, their silence somehow loud. Almalexia's statues stood as warnings, not just of tyranny, but of the pain that comes from holding power too long. They had become myths, not in the sense of lies, but of layered truths, half-remembered dreams that shaped a people more than they knew. And so Morrowind moved on, not in rebellion, but in reflection. It did not abandon the past, it digested it. The ghosts of gods lingered, not to haunt, but to teach. To remind that no power is eternal, that faith must be nurtured, not enforced, that even the divine are fallible. New leaders rose, not gods but mere. The Grand Council reclaimed power. The houses negotiated, warred, allied. The world moved again, uncertain but alive. The void left by the Tribunal became space for something else. Not a new pantheon, but a mosaic of voices. And yet, when the wind howled through the mountains of Vardenfell, or when the waters lapped at the stones of Vivek's temple, there were those who swore they still felt something. Not power, not presence, but memory. They would stand in silence and recall what it was like to believe, what it meant to see your gods walk among you, what it cost, and what it gave. In this, the people of Morrowind discovered a profound truth. Faith does not vanish with its gods. It transforms. It adapts. And in that transformation lies resilience. The Heart of Lorkhan had once gifted divine strength, but it was in its absence that the Dwemer found something deeper, the ability to carry on. Ash does not speak, and yet it remembers. It clings to ruins, nestles in its sacred hollows, and layers itself over forgotten roads like a soft burial shroud. In Morrowind, Ash is not just the byproduct of Red Mountain's fury. It is memory made physical. It is the silence left behind when voices cease, when temples fall, when gods go quiet. After Vivek's disappearance, the Dwemer people turned to what remained: ash, stone, and story. Across the volcanic plains of Vardenfell, stories rose from the dust like spectral silhouettes. Travelers spoke of seeing a flicker of a robed figure walking the ghost fence. Pilgrims claimed to hear verses from the 36 sermons whispered in the wind. In old shrines where no incense burned and no priest presided, offerings still appeared. Modest gifts, an ancestor's ring, a simple flower, a bowl of ash yam stew. These were not acts of worship in the old sense. They were conversations with absence. The people were not reaching toward divinity, but into memory, offering tokens not to gods, but to the space where gods had once been. In this strange aftertime, the Tribunal became less theology and more echo. Schools and mystic circles studied the sermons of Vivek not as scripture, but as riddled metaphors, keys to a deeper understanding of self, mortality, and myth. Some scholars began to suggest that the Tribunal had never been gods at all, merely mortals who wore the shape of divinity to guide a broken people. Others fiercely defended the truth of their godhood, even as their power faded. This debate of what was myth and what was memory became central to Dwemer identity. Faith had fractured, but in that fracture, many found freedom. It became possible to ask questions without fear, to challenge the old stories without heresy. The Tribunal, once beyond reproach, became complex figures of tragedy, wisdom, and warning. Some kept their likenesses, statues in gardens, paintings in family halls. not to inspire worship but remembrance. Almalexia's once mighty visage, now dulled with moss, stood in courtyards beside shrines to ancestors. Soothe Sill's mechanical diagrams, once considered sacred, became the foundation for secular study in arcane universities. Vivek's verses were sung by bards alongside epics of endural Nerevar, not as doctrine, but as legacy. And still, the ash whispered. Those walking alone across the wastes sometimes spoke of dreams, of golden masks, of wheels turning in darkness, of stars falling through time. Whether they were remnants of the heart's old resonance or echoes from Apocrypha, none could say. But the dreams carried meaning. They stirred something deep and ancient. A remembering. The Aedra too watched. Aedra, whose curse had once given the Dwemer their red eyes and ash-gray skin, had always warned them. The Tribunal's glory would fade. And so had. Yet Aedra did not gloat. Her silence was almost reverent. For even she had been part of this long, tangled tale. Bothia and Mephala, who had once taught the Chimer their ways, saw new paths forming, old altars being dusted off, the ancestral wheel turning once more. Not everyone embraced the change. In remote villages, there were still priests who lit candles in temple ruins, who wept while speaking the names of the three. These devotions, though rare, carried no grand promise. Only a desperate hope that something divine still listened. But perhaps the gods had never truly listened. Perhaps the act of speaking into the void had always been for the speaker. Among the Ashlanders, those nomadic people who had never fully accepted the tribunal, there was a quiet satisfaction. Not triumph, but confirmation. They had kept the old ways, preserved the true memory of Nerevar, and now watched the world slowly bend back toward their vision of truth. But even among them, the mood was not celebratory. There was no joy in being right about ruin, only a deeper mourning for what had been lost to pride and power. In time, the memory of the tribunal began to change. They were no longer just the betrayers of Nerevar or the gods of golden ages. They became symbols of hubris and hope, of mortal aspiration and inevitable decay. They became stories parents told children, not to teach obedience, but to teach the danger of forgetting one's limits. Stories about three who reached for the divine and, for a time, held it, but could not hold it forever. Even the Heart of Lorkhan, whose power had made gods of mortals, was now silent. Its beat, once faintly felt across the fabric of Nirn, no longer pulsed. And in that quiet, something new had begun, a turning away from external divinity and a return to something internal. The Dwemer people, ever resilient, ever ash-covered, did not fade with their gods. They endured, they adapted, they remembered, and the land remembered with them. Vardenfell still smoked. The wind still carried grit through its canyons. The ruins of Tribunal-era temples still cast long shadows over the scarred earth. But now, when those shadows fell, they did not frighten. They comforted. They told the truth, that even gods fall, and yet the people remain. So when the ghosts departed, when the last whispers of Vivek faded from the minds of the old, when the gears of Sothesill's world stopped turning, when the last temple candle burned out, there was not despair. There was reverence. For in the ash, in the echo, in the empty space where gods once stood, the Dwemer found something deeper than worship. They found themselves. Long after the dust had settled over lost battlegrounds and the gods' voices fell quiet, something curious remained. Myth. Not merely stories passed from mouth to mouth, but deep-rooted memories etched into the collective mind of mortals. The Heart of Lorkhan, though gone, continued to pulse faintly in dreams, in rituals, in the very architecture of belief. It had left the world, yes, but it had not left memory. What is a myth, if not the soul of a culture breathing in metaphor? In the northern halls of Skyrim, where snow buried the past in soft white blankets, the Nords told tales by hearthfire of Shor and his great trick. They did not call it treachery. They called it sacrifice. Shor, as they remembered him, had given of himself that the world might be born, torn asunder by jealous gods who sought to undo his work. His heart, cast down, became the fire at the center of the world. The Nords did not mourn it as lost. To them, it burned still deep beneath the bones of the earth. In the south, among the Sarodailic scholars, the myths had softened into parables. Lorkhan, or Shazar, as some called him, was viewed less as a trickster and more as the impulse of change, the will to become. Imperial philosophers debated whether he had truly meant for Mundus to be a prison or a proving ground. But regardless of their stance, most agreed, without Lorkhan, there would be no struggle, and thus no glory. The elves remembered differently. Among the Altmer, the memory was bitter. To them, Lorkhan was a villain, a being who deceived the Aedra, who tricked them into giving up their divinity to create a flawed world. They did not see beauty in mortality. They saw loss. Their myths painted the heart as a cursed thing, a seed of sorrow. And yet, even among the most devoted followers of Auriel, some whispered questions in private chambers. Why, if Mundus was such a mistake, did they still feel drawn to it? Why, if mortality was a punishment, did it sometimes feel like freedom? In Morrowind, even after the fall of the Tribunal, the memory of Lorkhan shimmered like heat over volcanic stone. The Chimer had once rejected him. The Dwemer had lived in his shadow. And now, with the Tribunal gone, some returned to the stories of the heart as seekers, not skeptics. In dusty halls, aged texts were opened once more. Sermons, riddles, and lost canticles were studied with fresh eyes. Across cultures, the myth had taken root not just in temples and tomes, but in dreams. Sleepers reported visions, indistinct at first, but resonant. A beating heart buried beneath a mountain. A god split in two. A wheel turning, and then breaking, and then turning again. Scholars and mystics alike began recording these dreams, comparing notes. They discovered strange similarities. A shared symbol, a voice without a mouth, a sense of something both terrible and necessary. They called it the echo of the heart. It was not power. It was not even presence. It was memory made myth, myth made resonance. Just as a bell leaves a faint trembling in the air long after it has been struck, so too did the heart leave behind a trembling in the fabric of reality. In the lands of the Khajiit, where moonlight dances between sugar fields, they spoke of Lorkhan, the moon beast, as both dark and divine. They believed he had walked the dark path, so his kin might walk in light. Among them, the heart was not something to fear, but to honor. They saw its loss not as the end, but as a return, the soul unmoored from form, ready to begin again. Among the Argonians, the story was stranger still. The Hist remembered Lorkhan not in form, but in vibration, the echo of his intention. To them, the world was not broken, but transforming. They did not grieve for the heart. They listened for its pulse in the water, in the reeds, in the breath of the marsh. Even in distant lands, where the tale had no name, something stirred. A merchant's child in Hammerfell dreamed of a heart beating beneath the sands. A Bosmere seer painted spirals on bark with no knowledge of what they meant. A reach which whispered verses that had not been spoken in living memory. The myth endured not because it was written, but because it was felt. And as Tamriel moved forward, through empires rising and falling, through dragons returned and crises averted, the heart remained. Not in the sky, nor in stone, but in the collective dream of all mortal beings. A memory of origin, a memory of choice. Because at its core, the myth of Lorkhan is not about betrayal, nor about power, nor even about gods. It is about the will to create, the willingness to fracture perfection in pursuit of meaning, to fall and rise and fall again, each time closer to understanding. And so, in monasteries and marketplaces, in caves and courts, in the silence before sleep, the myth breathes. A whisper in the dark. You are here because he was broken. A reply in the soul. And still we choose to build. When the gods withdrew from their thrones and the stars no longer whispered of divine wars, A peculiar stillness swept across Mundus. Not silence, for the world had never been truly silent, but something else. A resonance. A lingering note that refused to fade long after the music had ended. This was the echo of the heart. Not the heart itself, long shattered, lost beneath Red Mountain, but its impression, its footprint in the dust of existence. Like a memory you can't place, but feel in your bones. Like a word on the tip of your tongue, or a dream that slips away the moment you wake. Some would say this echo was only metaphor. The consequence of myth carried too long, too far, across too many voices. But those who listened carefully, those who studied the intervals between thoughts, between breath and heartbeat, would tell you differently. They would tell you the echo was alive. It lived in the cracks of the world, in the empty altars where no gods answered, in the faces of those who had nothing left to worship but still chose to kneel, in the way ash fell softly over old ruins, and how even silence could seem reverent. Mundus itself remembered. It remembered the breaking. It remembered the choice. And so did the people who walked its surface, though they often could not name the source. An orphan in the slums of the imperial city might feel it when staring up at a ruined statue. A healer in Elsewhere might sense it while chanting an old hymn, one older than even her grandmother's memory. A smith in the Reach might pause while striking steel, caught by a thought she could not explain. The echo was not Lorkhan's voice. It was the shape of his absence. It was the question he left behind, a question that haunted kings and beggars alike. If you could shape the world, would you? And if so, what price would you pay? This echo, soft, relentless, became the soil in which legends grew. It inspired mad prophets and solemn monks, revolutionaries and dreamers. It did not demand belief. It only offered a mirror. In that mirror, mortals saw not gods, but themselves. Flawed, mortal, capable. Some feared it. Others worshipped it, but most simply lived by it without knowing they did. The echo-shaped dreams. Across Tamriel, strange visions threaded through the sleep of mystics and children. A heart, enormous, suspended in a void of stars. A wheel spinning endlessly, shedding sparks that became lives. A bridge of light stretching from a mountain peak into nothingness. Some dismissed these as tricks of the mind. Others recorded them in sacred books. And a few built temples, not to gods, but to the echo itself, to that impossible memory of a god who fell and made space for others to rise. The heart was gone, but the act of its tearing, the sundering that made the world, that remained. And so the echo did more than haunt. It inspired. Among the Dwemer, the fall of the Tribunal left wounds too deep for easy healing. But the old myth of the heart returned in quiet ways. Pilgrims traveled the ghost fence, no longer to worship, but to reflect. They stood before ashen stones and whispered thanks, not to gods, but to the one who gave them the chance to struggle. Among the Nords, stories of Shore became less about divine victory and more about divine failure. But in that failure, there was a strange nobility. He had lost. He had died. But he had tried. And that effort, that rebellion against stasis, resonated with warriors and wanderers alike. In Somerset, some few dissidents dared to write new songs. Not about purity or lost divinity, but about the beauty of becoming, of accepting mortality, and finding joy in its short, fierce span. In Valenwood and Blackmarsh, the echo danced differently. Not as story, but as instinct, a quiet tuning of the soul to something deep, wordless, and true. Even the Empire, fractured and uncertain, found itself reshaped. The absence of dragonborn emperors forced new kinds of leaders to emerge, ones who ruled not by divine right, but by mortal effort. And though they would never say so aloud, some believed that the echo of the heart had helped birth this new age. An age not of destiny, but of decision. All across the world, statues crumbled, scrolls faded, songs were forgotten. But the echo endured. It endured in every act of creation, in every choice made with uncertainty, in every moment where someone stood at the edge of the unknown and stepped forward anyway. because the Heart of Lorkhan was not just a thing. It was a myth that became a metaphor that became a truth so deep that even those who rejected it still lived by its rhythm. And so the echo remains, not in stone or flame, but in the very act of living, in the quiet courage of the mundane, in the relentless striving of a world that refuses to stop becoming. Even now, as the stars shift and new threats rise, the echo hums beneath it all. Not loud, not insistent, but steady, patient, unforgotten, the echo that remains. It is said that the gods once walked among mortals, not as misty symbols or distant stars, but as presences, beings who shaped rivers with their hands and carved laws into the sky. In those early moments, before time had fully learned how to measure itself, the line between divinity and mortality was not yet drawn in stone. It shimmered, it shifted, and in that sacred in-between, something remarkable was born. The space between divinity, that is where the Heart of Lorkhan rests now, not in form or flame, but in idea. In the stillness where gods falter and mortals rise. In the margins where myths fray and something truer seeps through. What, then, does it mean to dwell in that space? The divines stand above, ever distant, radiant in their separateness. The Daedra dance along the edges, chaotic and unbound, seducing with truths too wild for safety. But between them, between worship and fear, between order and anarchy, there lies a path paved by Lorkhan's broken intent. A path not of answers, but of becoming. To walk that path is to walk without certainty. It is to rise not by right, but by resolve. In the annals of the Elder Scrolls, few names endure forever. Towers fall, empires crumble, even the stars flicker, but something remains quiet and consistent. The will of the mortal to seek, to ask, to change, to bear the weight of the world and still choose to shape it. This, perhaps, was Lorkhan's true gift. Not mundus, not mortality, but possibility. Within every life, from the humblest Khajiit thief to the loftiest Altmarai mage, exists a sliver of that divine dilemma. To reach beyond limits, to make something new, to err, to suffer, to endure. And in that striving, the gods themselves are mirrored. For what is a god, if not a dream that refused to die? Perhaps that is why the heart had to be torn free, because it was never meant to remain static. It was never meant to be held by hands that sought to lock it away. It was not a treasure, nor a tool, nor a throne. It was a spark, one meant to be passed on. In ancient Velothai shrines, the heart is never named directly. It is spoken of in riddles. In Dwemer etchings, it is drawn as a singularity collapsing inward, the antithesis of order. In the chants of the skull, it is simply the deep pulse, the hidden rhythm that speaks only to those who listen long enough. All agree on one thing. It was never a gift freely given. It was torn, stolen, fractured, but in that act of transgression, something necessary emerged. For stagnation, even divine, is a kind of death. And Lorkhan, whatever else he may have been, was never still. He was movement, disruption, the storm that breaks and reshapes. Now, in this present age, as Tamriel dreams on, fractured and uncertain, the legacy of that movement endures, not in grand temples, not in relics locked behind stone, but in the simple act of choosing. To choose kindness where cruelty is easier, to speak truth where silence is safer, to build where others destroy. Each act, however small, is a defiance, a whisper of rebellion, a mirror held up to gods who no longer walk among us. And in that reflection, that shimmer between what was and what might be, Lorkhan lives on. He lives in questions more than answers. He lives in the weary arms of a farmer tilling cursed soil, still believing the harvest will come. He lives in the chant of a monk who doubts yet prays. In the ink of a scholar searching for a myth that cannot be proven, but is too powerful to be dismissed. He lives not because he was right, but because he dared. And now, as the wheel turns once more and the old powers shift in their slumber, it is left to the mortals, always the mortals, to decide what meaning they will make of the pieces left behind. Will they try to rebuild the heart? Will they seek to tame it, to bind its fire again in metal and magic? Or will they leave it scattered, as Lorkhan might have wanted, each fragment a chance for something new? There is beauty in uncertainty. There is wonder in becoming. And there, in that uncertain space between gods and ghosts, the story continues. Not with a roar, not with prophecy, but with the quiet footfall of a soul walking into the unknown, carrying within them a spark of the divine. In the quiet of the deepest caverns beneath Red Mountain, where magma glows with a pulsing red light and the earth groans with ancient memory, something sleeps. Not dead, not gone, only still, only waiting. The heart of Lorkhan, what remains of it, lies there not in body, but in echo. It has been shattered, cast away, defiled, and misunderstood, but it has never been truly silenced. For even broken things retain their meaning, especially broken things. The gods have turned their faces. The Tribunal has faded. The Dwemer are dust. The myths that once surrounded the heart have scattered, like ash on wind. Yet despite all of this, its pulse is still felt. Subtle, beneath words, beneath thought. Not all things that sleep are at peace. The Dwemer once sought to master the heart, to harness it, to escape the curse of mortality. But in doing so, they forgot the lesson Lorkhan offered, that divinity, when forced, collapses inward. They tried to reach heaven by machinery, and instead vanished from all known space. The heart, unmoved, endured. The Tribunal tried to bind it to themselves, to ascend, to protect Morrowind through stolen fire. They succeeded for a time, but the cost was erosion of self, of truth, of faith. Even gods bleed when they forget humility, and the heart, ever silent, watched. Even now, pilgrims and scholars speak of it in hushed tones. In distant lands, whispered rituals try to summon echoes of its power. Some think it a relic of a more magical age, a curiosity lost to time. Others still believe it listens. Perhaps it does, because the heart is not a thing. It is an idea, a presence, the seed of contradiction placed at the center of everything. That the world is pain, but it is also beautiful. That mortality is cruel, but is also sacred. That we are meant to suffer and to transcend. And so it sleeps, not because it must, but because the time is not yet right. What might awaken it again? A tower rebuilt? A new god born? Or perhaps something quieter? A child who dreams of walking among stars? Or a wanderer who forgives where revenge once burned? The heart listens for these things, for small revolutions, for quiet courage. In the vast, mythic weave of Nirn, where time is a wheel and stories circle endlessly, the heart has become less a center and more a mirror. It reflects what we dare to believe about ourselves. It does not command. It invites. To look into the heart is to be confronted by your own desire for power, for love, for truth. It shows nothing that was not already within you. That is why it was feared. That is why it was broken. Yet in being broken, it was made eternal. All across Tamriel, one can feel its absence, like a missing chord in a forgotten song. And yet, its presence lingers in that very emptiness, in the stories told around campfires, in the mysteries carved into stone ruins, in the dreams of mages who reach beyond their means, a silence that is never quite still. Some say the heart must never return, that to awaken it is to invite calamity, to risk another collapse, another distortion of the world's fragile balance. Others say that without it, the world cannot be healed, that without Lorkhan's vision, flawed and tragic as it was, we are destined to stagnate. But perhaps both are true. Perhaps that is the nature of the heart, not to answer, but to ask, not to heal, but to wound in ways that bring wisdom. And so the world continues. Mountains rise, towers fall, empires drift into myth. But beneath it all, in a space untouched by time or decay, the heart sleeps on. It waits not to be claimed, but to be understood. The Nerevarine is gone. Kagranak's tools are lost. Red Mountain is quiet. But that does not mean the story is over. In Elder Scrolls yet unread, in dreams yet dreamed, the heart stirs. And in each of us, there's a piece of that same spark. The longing to shape our own world, to challenge the divine, to love despite the inevitability of loss. This is the legacy of Lorkhan. Not divinity stolen, but divinity discovered within. Let this be the final whisper, that the heart is not only a relic of chaos, but a reminder of hope. That in the shadows of broken myths, something luminous still breathes. And as you drift now into sleep, let that breath guide you, not into fear, but into wonder, into the boundless mystery of what comes next, into the deep, sacred silence, where the heart still sleeps beneath.